Hey there, church. Here we go again with another deep dive into the Word of our Creator, the lover, giver of life, the words of life. Right here in Isaiah chapters 1 and 2, we learned last week that the first part of Isaiah's vision given to him by God describes Judah as one person, an adulterous person that does not know God or consider him and his ways. They were given the description the same as Israel, right? The northern kingdom was given by Hosea, a prophet writing to them at the exact same time. How wild is that? God giving the prophets writing to all of his people the same language. And he uses the language like, the whole head is sick. You rulers of Sodom, you people of Gomorrah. It's very strong language, and he questions them with questions of like a trial lawyer, okay? Or a lawyer that's really trying to get to the bottom of something here. He says, "To what purpose is a multitude of your sacrifices to me?" Like, why are you doing this? To which any normal person would rhetorically respond, because this is how we've always done it. Ooh, don't like that answer. And God would go on to say in response to that rhetorical idea, "Come on now, and let's sit down and reason together." He doesn't say sit down, but he says, "Come and let's reason together." And then talks through what God's going to do to keep his covenant. Remember, there were a couple things that God was going to do. And then chapter 2 introduces us to the God above all other gods, and how he will supernaturally, right, as a river being drawn upstream, or up a mountain, he will supernaturally draw every people of every nation to himself one day. So then, we're starting today in chapter 2, verse 5. It starts a whole new section where Isaiah sees that there is a day coming. We would call it the day of the Lord, when the Lord is going to humble the proud so that he alone is to be worshipped and everyone will recognize him as the one and only. A direct juxtaposition to the position that he seems to be in here in the first part of the book, where he is not the one and only. Israel has forgotten him. He is not the center of the world, and here we see that Christ is going to make it clear that he alone is worthy to be worshipped, and so he's going to introduce this concept of the day of the Lord. If you want a fun concept, or a fun little study, go study the day of the Lord, and see and really discover what the people of Isaiah would have known about the day of the Lord at the time of this writing. It's really interesting, but I don't want to get sidetracked today, so sorry. Starting in verse 5, he says this: "O house of Jacob, come and let us walk in the light of the Lord," which is directly correlated to how they are not walking. Just a few minutes earlier in the passage, he had told them how they were adulterous, and that God is going to have to act. They're forcing his hand here. So Isaiah says, hey, instead of God doing all this work alone, which we saw that he said he would do, he says, why don't we keep some of our end of the covenant, and let's walk in the light of the Lord. This concept is one that's going to be called upon in the Gospels and Paul. Later on in Ephesians 5:8, Paul would actually say, when he talks to the Ephesian church, about walking as children of light. The concept of walking in the light is not new to Paul, but probably something he picked up from Isaiah here in this book, or maybe another Old Testament book. So Isaiah encourages an active obedience, one that puts God first in everything. But you can feel the tide of how Isaiah's poetry goes here. Notice over and over again, the theme starts dark and then gets light towards the end. We're going to see this repeatedly throughout the book. So verses 6 through 9 have the dark feeling, where the charges are laid against the people. It's said that they're filled with the eastern ways. They're pleased with the children of foreigners. And that their reasoning for that kind of makes sense, because the foreigners' land is filled or full of silver, gold, treasure, horses, chariots, idols, and they're hard workers. What's not to love about these people? I mean, they sound good. but they sound like a people that you would want to be involved with. But notice that all those things that Isaiah declares there that about these foreign nations, they're all man's things. They're all things that man thinks are important, that man finds appealing. However, the focus shouldn't be on the things of this world, right? And the focus of these people isn't on God at all either. So they've sought the things of this world, and they've found them. They're adulterous in every sense at this point, the people of Israel, or the people of Judah and the people of Israel, written to by Hosea. They have moved on, in a sense, from God to something they find more appealing. Sound familiar? So here it comes, right? Verse number 10 says, enter into the rock, and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. Wow. God is going to take man down a notch and take his rightful place as ruler. Verse 11 says, the lofty looks of man shall be humbled. The haughtiness of man shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. This is sounding a lot like what Hosea is telling the people up north in Israel. Chapter 2 of his book to them in verse 14 says this, therefore I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards, and I will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and you will no longer call me my master. I will remove the names of the Baals from her lips. No longer will their names be invoked. In that day I will create a covenant for them, or I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field, with the birds of the skies, and the creatures that move along the ground. Does that sound like Genesis? Bow and sword and battle I will abolish from the land, so that all may lie down in safety. I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you into righteousness and justice, in love and compassion. I will betroth you in faithfulness, and you will acknowledge the Lord. How awesome is that imagery in the poetry? It's almost of a wedding, you know? And Isaiah writes similarly in verse 11 of chapter 2, the Lord will be exalted in that day. So the Lord is going to be the bridegroom that day. So let's keep going though. Verses 12 through 18 says this. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low. Upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, upon all the oaks of Bashan, upon all the high mountains, and upon all the hills that are lifted up, upon every high tower and upon every fortified wall, upon all the ships of Tarshish, and upon all the beautiful slopes. The loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of man shall be brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. Have we heard that? But the idols shall be utterly abolished. Does that sound like Hosea? Another time we see here that in the day of the Lord, the Lord alone will be exalted. And as Hosea said, the idols or the Baals are going to be abolished. This goes back to what Isaiah said earlier when he pronounces that God or the Lord is greater than all other gods, and he will have no competition. Before we finish this chapter up, though, we're going to look at some cool eschatology, Day of the Lord stuff. And before we get to that, I want to ask you, though, in relationship to what we just read, where are you at in your walk with the Lord? This goes back all the way to chapter 1, a little bit at the start of chapter 2. Where are you at with your walking with the Lord? Do you know him? Do you have the things of this world at the forefront of your mind? Is that all you think about? Do you think about those things more than you think on God and his word? Because in reality, if we're not focused on God and his mission daily, then he's not number one. And if I woke up daily and just ignored my family and the things that my wife needed help with and acted as though my kids didn't exist and you would probably call me a terrible father and a terrible husband. What kind of relationship is that? If I ignored them in their wants to go after money and things, or in the case of Israel here, women, adulteress, would you consider me to have a strong family relationship? Probably not. The imagery here is pointing to Israel that they don't know their God. And the imagery of a spouse comes into play over and over again here. Are you doing that with your relationship with your Creator God? With the lover of your soul? He died for you and for me. Are you living for Him? Do you know Him? Or are you like Israel here and you're more focused on the cool things of this world? With that, let's continue on. Verse 19 through 22, okay? Verse 19, it says, "They shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth from the terror of the Lord and the glory of His majesty, when He arises to shake the earth mightily. And in that day, man will cast away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, which they made each for himself to worship. And they're going to throw them to the moles and the bats, to go into the clefts of the rocks and into the crags of the rugged rocks, from the terror of the Lord and the glory of His majesty, when He arises to shake the earth mightily. Sever yourselves from such a man, whose breath is in his nostrils, for of what account is he?" Wow. Before we move to chapter 3, right before this, I teased the eschatology part, or the study of end times things. I just want to hit that real quick before we go to chapter 3. Verses 10, 19, and 21. Notice they all have this very familiar reading. Verse 10, "Enter into the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of His majesty." Verse 19, "There shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth from the terror of the Lord and the glory of His majesty, when He arises to shake the earth mightily." Verse 21, "To go into the clefts of the rocks and into the crates of the rugged rocks from the terror of the Lord and the glory of His majesty, when He arises to shake the earth mightily." Interesting. Now let me read for you real quick 2 Thessalonians 1, verses 9 and 10. "These," those who reject God, okay, "these shall be punished with an everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and the glory of His power, when He comes in that day to be worshipped, to be glorified in His saints, and to be admired among all those who believe, because our testimony among you was believed." And then further on, that was speaking of the day of the Lord, and further on in Revelation 6, we see it this way. Verses 15 through 17 of chapter 6, it's speaking here of the sixth seal judgment, okay? It says, "And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, 'Fall on us, and hide us from the face of Him who sits on the throne, from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of His wrath is come, and who is able to stand?'" Once again, the idea is they're running to the mountains, they're running to the rocks, and they're praying that the rocks will fall on them, because the day of the Lord is come. So these three passages, Thessalonians, Revelation, Isaiah, they all speaking of a future time. So what? Notice why this happens, why he repeats this 3 times. Because of the rejection of God. The verses around these 3 parts in Isaiah 2 give us some idea, okay? Verse 11 says, "The prideful look of man will be humbled." What are they proud of? Well, read the verses prior. What they had done. What they were so proud of themselves. Verse 17 repeats right before verse 19, "The pride of man shall be bowed down. The Lord alone will be exalted. God will abolish or destroy the idols." But by verse 20, man is casting their idols and throwing them away. Why? Because they've realized their futility. Vanity of vanities, as Solomon would write. If we prioritize the things of this world more than we prioritize the things of God, His word, His people, Him, which this passage is proclaiming, then we've missed the point of life. So he ends chapter 2 with, stop trusting in humans who have breath in their nostrils. Why do you hold them in high esteem? Or why do you hold them in esteem? It's rhetorical. They're powerless. They're futile. They're vain. All the things in this world, except God alone. So we come to chapters 3 and 4, okay? We're going to get through chapters 3 and 4 today. So we have judgment declared on all of Judah. The Lord, starting in verses 1 through 3, talks about how God will be taking all of the most precious and talented people away from Judah and Jerusalem. And verse 4 states that they will be ruled by children and babes. Now we know that this is in fact a bad idea, right? But this may be where Solomon got the fact from when he said in Ecclesiastes 10:16, woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your priests feast in the morning. That actually carries the connotation from chapter 5 of Isaiah that drunkards were rising early to find their next drink to binge on, and who are controlled by that drink. So this has a strong connotation in chapter 5, and we'll get to that next week. Verses 6 through 12 continues this line of thought, though, saying that the people will try to find anyone who will lead them rightly. And that's funny because my wife and I were talking the other day about this point and how important godly leadership is within God's people. Today, or back then, read through the Kings and the Chronicles, and you will find that spelled out very clearly. Leadership, godly leadership, is extremely important to his people. The rest of the chapter, verses 13 through 26 of chapter 3, go on to depict the people once again as a rich people who have completely left their true love. Verse 14 talks about the elders and the princes being judged for taking from the poor. Their plunder is in their houses. The imagery in verse 15 is of crushing the faces of the poor. And that comes from Micah chapter 3, who once again is writing to Israel at the exact same time. So this is across the board. Israel, Judah, everyone is oppressing the poor. The rich are getting richer. I mean, does it sound familiar? Verses 16 through 26 describe Judah as a whole, as a woman who had given herself completely over to the things of this world and left her husband. Someone who became so entangled with someone other than her first love that the thing they left their first love for eventually becomes their downfall. Which leaves us with the conclusion of chapter 4. There's only 6 verses in chapter 4, so this will be quick, but the conclusion is an interesting one to the poem here. And a transition to almost a commentary of what will happen. The poetry stops. The end of chapters 3 and 4 poem is this. Verse 2. In that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the earth shall be excellent and appealing for those of Israel who have escaped. So the day of the Lord here is one where the people are judged on how they treat God and how they treat each other. Notice throughout that if they were treating God rightly, they would have treated each other rightly. But they never knew God. Remember that? They had become so enamored with the things of this life that which had turned into greed and terrible treatment of those around them, namely the poor, that if they had kept God number one, then they would have realized, as chapter 1 and 2 stated, that God was not interested in empty actions. He wants hearts to change and to treat him with the awe and reverence that he deserves, as well as treating others with the dignity and respect that they deserve. So the end of the poem puts it succinctly. The fruit of the earth shall be excellent and appealing for those of Israel who have escaped, or those who know God. So it ends with the commentary that God will provide shelter for everyone who is called holy by the end of this. God will wash away the filth and clean up those he has set aside for his purpose. So we come to the end of this and we ask, so what? Who cares about all this? Glad you asked. Where are you at with your walk with God? Are you someone that is more enamored with the things of this life? Because God loves you more than those things do. God wants more for you than those things that you desire that are not of his will. Do you trust him, though, enough to make him number one, where he should be from the time you wake up until the time you go to bed? Is your life a reflection of that? This is some heavy stuff, man. Or are you just going through the motions? You know, you can come to church, you can, sing all the Christian music you want, but without a changed heart, without putting God first every day, it's empty. The people of Judah were doing religious things, but they didn't even know God. Wow. That is a serious indictment for me, for the church today. They were doing the right, they were offering the sacrifices, remember? And God said, why are you even doing that? Imagine God today, and he sits here, he looks at you reading his word, maybe half-heartedly, thinking about something else. You're driving down the road and you're listening to Christian music, but your mind is not worshiping. It is off on the next task. You sit down to do your devos and it's maybe 5 minutes a day. At the end of the day, you just squeeze it in at the end. Would he get from your life that you know him? Would he get from your actions and how you treat him and how you treat others that you know him? What is the reason that you do what you do? Would he be able to look at you and say, why are you doing that? Is that what he needs to do? Sometimes, I sit down and I go to read the word and, maybe he comes down, he's like, why are you even doing that? Your mind's not in the word. Your mind's off on, tomorrow's tasks, or your mind is off on something else. Why are you even doing that? So, what is the reason that you are doing what you do? And if it's not God, then let's start that process of change, okay? Change, it's a hard word, and a lot of people don't like it. But God will keep his end of the bargain here. He is a loving father. He is a fantastic husband of the bride someday, the church, right? And he wants absolutely nothing but the best for his children. And he desires that they get to know him. And the more we know him, the more we'll become like him. And the more we'll love him and we'll love others around us. And the things of this world will get put in their proper perspective. All right? Well, that's enough for today. I know it was heavy there at the end. I hope you stuck with it. And I hope you'll look to start that process of change if you need to. And if you don't need to, if you're really heavy in the word right now and you're right with God, I just want to encourage you. Keep it up. Keep strong. Keep going. Love it. That's encouraging. And if you want to reach out to me at any point this week and just ask about things that you could do to improve focus or improve in the study of God's word, I'd be happy to talk with you. And with that, we'll see you next week. Love you guys.